The year 1976 was supposed to be a season of celebration across the United States of America. It was the bicentennial year, a time of grand parades, red, white, and blue bunting draped over porch railings, and a collective sense of national pride. In Oakland County, Michigan, the atmosphere was particularly idyllic. This was a place of sprawling suburbs, quiet cul-de-sacs, and a deep-seated belief that the dangers of the world were things that happened elsewhere, in the crowded streets of Detroit, or the distant pages of history books. Children in communities like Ferndale, Royal Oak, and Birmingham lived with a level of freedom that seems almost mythical today. They rode their bicycles until the streetlights flickered to life, walked alone to local shops to buy candy with spare change, and played in the dense patches of woods that still dotted the landscape. There was an unspoken social contract among the residents, a trust that every adult on the block was looking out for every child. But that sense of security was about to be shattered by a predator so cold and calculated that he would come to be known as a ghost, a shadow that moved through the suburbs without leaving a trace. The disruption of this normalcy began on a freezing evening in February 1976. 12-year-old Mark Stebbins was a typical boy of his era, known for his energy and his love of the outdoors. On the afternoon of February 15th, Mark left the American Legion Hall in Ferndale after a youth event. He told his friends he was heading home, a short walk that should have taken only a few minutes. But Mark never arrived. As the hours ticked by and the winter sun dipped below the horizon, his family's concern sharpened into a cold, piercing panic. The police were notified, and a massive search effort was launched, but the suburban landscape offered no clues. There were no witnesses, no sounds of a struggle, and no signs of where the young boy could have gone. For 19 days, the community held its breath, praying for a miracle while fearing the worst. The answer came on a frigid afternoon when Mark's body was discovered in a corporate parking lot in Southfield. He had been carefully laid out, his clothes clean and neatly pressed, his hair freshly washed. The chilling detail that horrified investigators was the realization that the boy had been kept alive for days, and his killer had taken the time to groom him before discarding him like a macabre doll. The discovery of Mark Stebbins sent a shockwave through Michigan, but many hoped it was an isolated act of madness. That hope was extinguished when a pattern began to emerge, revealing a predator who was both patient and precise. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. In December of that same year, the nightmare returned with the disappearance of 12-year-old Jill Robinson. She had left her home in Royal Oak after an argument with her mother, intending to run away for a few hours to clear her head. She never made it past the end of her street. Her bicycle was found leaning against a tree, but Jill was gone. Days later, her body was found alongside Interstate 75. Like Mark, she had been killed by a single shotgun blast, and like Mark, she was found in a state of unsettling cleanliness. The calculated nature of these crimes suggested that the perpetrator was not just a killer, but someone who derived power from the total control he held over his victims during their captivity. The psychological toll on the parents of Oakland County became a heavy, suffocating weight. The once friendly neighborhoods were now filled with a toxic atmosphere of suspicion and dread. Every stranger in a parked car was a potential monster. Every neighbor who kept his curtains drawn was a subject of whispered rumors. Mothers and fathers who used to wave at each other across manicured lawns now looked at one another with eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. The weight of uncertainty was the most grueling part of the ordeal. Parents would sit by their windows watching the empty streets, wondering if their child would be the next one to vanish into the gray Michigan winter. The routine of daily life became a series of military-style maneuvers. Children were no longer allowed to walk to school, even if the building was only 2 blocks away. Playdates were canceled, and the local parks, once echoing with the sounds of laughter and games, fell into a haunting silence. The loss of childhood innocence was not a gradual process. It was an abrupt theft, a violent seizing of the safety that every child deserves. By the time 1977 arrived, the county was in a state of total paralysis. The abduction of 10-year-old Christine Mihelic in January and 11-year-old Timothy King in March confirmed that the killer was still active and seemingly invisible to the law. Curfews were enacted and the police presence was constant, yet the predator seemed to mock the authorities. He moved through the snowy streets like a phantom, snatching children from well-lit areas and returning them to locations where they were guaranteed to be found quickly, as if he wanted the world to see his handiwork. The terror was no longer just about the acts themselves, but about the absolute lack of leads. The community was fighting an enemy they could not see, a shadow that knew their habits and their weaknesses. Amidst the chaos and the desperate search for answers, a few thin threads of evidence began to surface. Witnesses began to speak of a specific vehicle seen near the sites of the disappearances, a blue American Motors gremlin that seemed to linger in the background of several scenes. This mysterious car would soon become the primary focus of an investigation that would span decades, but in those early, dark days it was just another ghost in a county full of them. The shadow over Oakland County was growing longer, and the invisible predator was only just beginning to leave his mark on history. The investigation into the Oakland County murders soon hit a wall that seemed insurmountable. While the police worked around the clock, the lack of physical evidence was baffling. In 1977, forensic science was nowhere near the sophisticated level it is today. There were no databases for DNA, no high-resolution satellite tracking, and no digital footprints to follow. The killer seemed to understand this perfectly. Every time a body was found, the crime scene was sterile. The children were returned to the public eye in a state that was both respectful and deeply disturbing. Their clothes were freshly laundered and their bodies were clean, as if the perpetrator were playing a sick game of showing the world that he could keep them for days and leave no trace of his presence behind. This cleanliness was a psychological blow to the investigators. It suggested a person who was not just a predator, but someone with a methodical, almost surgical obsession with order. Detectives spent hours sifting through dirt and snow, hoping for a single hair or a drop of blood, but the invisible predator left nothing but a lingering sense of failure. The public outcry grew louder with every passing day. Citizens were no longer content to wait for the authorities to act. In the neighborhoods of Birmingham and Royal Oak, fathers and older brothers organized citizen patrols. They walked the streets with flashlights and walkie-talkies, their eyes searching every shadow for the mysterious blue American Motors gremlin that had been reported. These men were driven by a mixture of protective instinct and raw, unbridled fury. The pressure on local law enforcement reached a breaking point. Every press conference was a gauntlet of angry questions and tearful pleas from parents who felt that the police were failing their children. The fear was so thick, it was almost a physical presence in the air. People stopped going to work and the schools felt like fortresses under siege. Local gymnasiums were converted into meeting halls where hundreds of terrified residents gathered to demand that the governor of Michigan take more drastic measures. It was during this peak of hysteria that the media began to use a name that would haunt Michigan for generations: the Oakland County child killer. This moniker was not just a headline, it was a brand of terror. Television news broadcasts and newspapers like the Detroit News amplified the dread, turning the search into a high-profile spectacle. While the press served to keep the community informed, it also created a feedback loop of fear. Every time the name was spoken on the evening news, a new wave of panic rippled through the suburbs. The psychological impact on the investigators was immense. They were not just fighting a ghost. They were fighting the clock and the crushing weight of public expectation. Being the target of such an intense manhunt often drives criminals into hiding, but this predator seemed to thrive on the attention. He was a shadow that the media kept shining a spotlight on, yet he never flinched. The moniker gave the killer a dark identity, a persona that felt larger than life and twice as dangerous. As the months dragged on, the task force was flooded with thousands of leads. Some were well-meaning citizens reporting suspicious neighbors, while others were more sinister, coming from individuals looking to settle old scores or gain a moment of fame. The emotional toll of these dead-end leads was agonizing for the victims' families and the police alike. Detectives would spend weeks trailing a suspect only to have them cleared by the most painful evidence. A man might have the right car and a history of odd behavior, but then an alibi would surface, or his physical characteristics would not match the few vague descriptions provided by witnesses. Each time a suspect was ruled out, a small piece of hope died within the department. The investigators were exhausted, their personal lives crumbling under the weight of a case that refused to be solved. They were chasing shadows in a blizzard, and every path they followed led back to the same cold, empty realization that they were no closer to the truth than they had been on the day Mark Stebbins disappeared. Internal conflict also began to hinder the progress of the multi-jurisdictional operation. In a case of this magnitude, the overlap between local police departments, the Michigan State Police, and federal agents from the FBI was inevitable. However, the coordination was far from seamless. Different agencies often had different priorities, and information was not always shared as freely as it should have been. Egos clashed over who would take the lead in the investigation, and important pieces of data were sometimes lost in a sea of manual paperwork and unfiled reports. This lack of a unified front gave the killer a distinct advantage. He operated across city lines, knowing that the borders between different police jurisdictions were often cracks that he could slip through. The tension between the various agencies became a story in itself, as the public began to sense that the hunters were as disorganized as the predator was disciplined. Despite the friction, the search for the blue gremlin continued with a feverish intensity. The police checked tens of thousands of vehicle registrations, stopping every car that even remotely matched the description. It was a monumental task that ultimately led to more frustration. The car seemed to exist only in the peripheral vision of a panicked public, a phantom vehicle for a phantom killer. Just as the investigation seemed to be entering its darkest and most stagnant phase, a new development occurred that changed the entire landscape of the hunt. A letter arrived at the precinct, followed by a series of anonymous telephone calls that provided information that could not have been known by the general public. This anonymous tipper suggested that the authorities were looking in the wrong places entirely. The killer, the source claimed, was not a drifter or a typical loner living on the fringes of society. Instead, the tip pointed toward the very circles of influence that the police were often hesitant to investigate. It suggested that the predator was someone hidden in plain sight, a person of high status who used their reputation as a shield. This revelation sent a chill through the core of the task force, as they realized that the monster they were hunting might be someone they respected, someone with the power to make the investigation disappear altogether. The final chapter of this long and agonizing nightmare began on a cold, overcast evening in March 1977. 11-year-old Timothy King had left his home in Birmingham with a simple mission to buy a candy bar at a local drugstore. It was a mundane errand in a neighborhood where children were supposed to be safe, but Timothy never returned. His disappearance sent a fresh wave of lightning through a community that was already paralyzed by fear. This was the fourth child to vanish in just over a year, and the realization that the predator was still active, despite the massive police presence, was a crushing psychological blow. For 6 days, the entire state of Michigan held its breath as thousands of volunteers and officers combed through snowy fields and wooded areas, praying for a miracle that would never come. On the evening of March 22nd, 2 teenagers driving down a rural road in Livonia noticed something unusual in a ditch near the pavement. It was the body of Timothy King. The scene was hauntingly familiar to the investigators who arrived shortly after. Like the victims who had come before him, Timothy had been meticulously cleaned. His clothes had been freshly laundered and pressed, and his body bore the signs of a captor who was not merely a killer, but someone who sought to maintain a perverse sense of order and control. The autopsy revealed a detail that would haunt the public for decades. Timothy's final meal had been fried chicken, suggesting that during his days in captivity, he had been fed and cared for in a domestic setting before being murdered. The invisible predator had once again proven that he could operate with impunity, treating the lives of children as part of a sick, calculated game. Then, as suddenly as the horror had begun, the abduction stopped. The silence that followed was not a relief to the people of Oakland County. It was a different, more lingering form of torture. There were no more bodies found in the snow, and no more reports of a mysterious blue American Motors gremlin stalking the streets. The task force, which had grown to include hundreds of officers and federal agents from the FBI, was left with a mountain of files but no one to place in handcuffs. Speculation began to fill the vacuum of information. Some believed the killer had died in a freak accident or had taken his own life to escape the tightening noose of the investigation. Others feared he had been arrested for an unrelated crime and was sitting in a prison cell, laughing at the authorities while his dark secrets remained hidden. In the years and decades that followed, the search for the Oakland County child killer shifted from a frantic manhunt to a slow, methodical pursuit of justice through the lens of history. Several key suspects emerged from the shadows of the original investigation. One of the most prominent was a man named Christopher Bush, who came from a family with significant wealth and political influence. Bush had a history of dark impulses and lived in the immediate area where several of the victims had vanished. He even owned a vehicle that closely matched the descriptions of the car seen near the abduction sites. However, Bush took his own life in 1978, and the physical evidence available at the time was not enough to definitively link him to the murders. When DNA technology finally became a viable tool in the early 2000s, investigators hoped for a breakthrough. They tested old hair samples and clothing, but the results were maddeningly inconclusive, neither fully condemning nor fully clearing the suspects who had long been dead. The pursuit of justice was kept alive not just by the police, but by the families of the victims who refused to let the world forget. Parents like Barry King, the father of Timothy, became relentless advocates for the truth. They pushed for the reopening of files and the application of every new scientific advancement, from advanced genetic genealogy to more sensitive chemical analysis of the evidence. These families have carried the weight of 1976 and 1977 for nearly 50 years. They have lived through the birthdays and graduations their children never had, their lives permanently divided into the time before the tragedy and the long, hollow years after. The trauma did not just affect the immediate relatives, it changed the very fabric of Michigan society. The era of the latchkey child ended in those suburbs, replaced by a culture of constant supervision and a loss of the communal trust that had once defined the American dream. As we look back at the legacy of the Oakland County child killer, we are forced to confront a haunting reflection of our own society. The case remains one of the most significant unsolved mysteries in the history of American crime, a reminder that some predators are skilled enough to slip through the cracks of even the most intensive investigations. Whether the killer was a person of high status protected by their circles of influence, or a lone wolf who simply vanished into the fog of time, his impact is still felt in the quiet streets of Birmingham and Royal Oak. The mystery has become a ghost that refuses to fade, a somber meditation on the cost of the unknown. The files remain open in the offices of local law enforcement, and every few years a new tip or a new scientific technique brings a brief flicker of hope to the cold case. But as the decades pass and the witnesses grow old, the chance of a definitive resolution grows thinner. We are left with the enduring image of a snowy Michigan night and the empty space where a child should have been. The Oakland County child killer may have escaped the justice of man, but the memory of his victims remains a permanent part of the landscape, a testament to the innocence that was stolen and the mystery that remains an unresolved echo in the heart of the community. The story ends not with a gavel hitting a bench, but with the quiet, persistent search for a truth that stays just out of reach.